Is this some kind of diversity experiment? Richard Collins said with a crooked grin, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. A wave of restrained laughter rolled through the polished chamber. Even the court reporter hesitated before lowering her eyes back to the keyboard. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, while the old air conditioning pushed cool air across rows of polished oak benches. Judge Maya Williams paused at the entrance for only a heartbeat. The black robe rested neatly over her shoulders, its fabric catching the pale morning light pouring through the tall courthouse windows. She heard every laugh, every whisper, every quiet assumption. Her polished shoes echoed across the marble floor, one measured step after another. No hurry. No hesitation. Richard leaned back in his chair with effortless confidence, straightening the expensive silver cufflinks beneath his tailored navy suit. 23 years without losing a major case had taught him one dangerous habit. He believed he could read people within seconds. Young judge. Black woman. Calm face. Easy target. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said, stretching the last two words until they sounded more like a joke than respect. Several attorneys smiled without looking directly at Maya. The bailiff shifted uneasily beside the courtroom door. Maya climbed the 2 wooden steps toward the bench without acknowledging anyone. She placed a worn leather folder beside the gavel with careful precision. The faint click echoed louder than expected. Somehow the room felt smaller. Hotter. More crowded. Richard noticed the folder and smirked. "I hope somebody explained today's case to you. It can get complicated." Another ripple of laughter spread across the gallery. Maya slowly removed a pair of reading glasses from the folder and rested them on the bench without speaking. Her silence unsettled people more than anger ever could. The digital courtroom clock clicked to exactly 9 o'clock. Every second sounded unusually sharp. The clerk stood. "All rise." Chairs scraped across the hardwood floor. The room stood together. Maya finally looked up. Her dark eyes moved across every face with calm precision, never lingering long enough to reveal what she was thinking. When they reached Richard, he answered with another confident smile, almost daring her to react. She did not. "Please be seated." Her voice was steady, warm, and impossible to interrupt. The room obeyed almost instinctively. Richard slid a thick stack of documents onto his table. The papers landed with a satisfying thud. "The facts are simple," he announced before anyone invited him to speak. "My client deserves a swift judgment today." Maya raised one finger without lifting her voice. "Counselor Collins." He stopped mid-sentence. "You will speak when the court recognizes you." The silence that followed felt different. Heavy. Richard forced a smile. "Of course, Your Honor." But irritation flickered behind his eyes. Maya opened the leather folder. Inside rested only a few pages. Richard almost laughed again. He had arrived with thousands of pages, expert witnesses, digital exhibits, and months of preparation. She carried almost nothing. Confidence surged back into his chest. This would be over before lunch. Then Maya reached beneath the folder and placed a plain white envelope onto the bench. No court markings. No attorney seals. No evidence sticker. Just one handwritten date across the front. Richard frowned. His heartbeat slowed for the first time that morning. He had never seen that envelope before. Neither had anyone else in the courtroom. Maya rested her fingertips gently on top of it and lifted her eyes toward him. "Before we begin," she said quietly, "there is one piece of evidence this court has not yet discussed." Richard's confident smile disappeared. The faint rustle of expensive suits swept through the courtroom as every eye locked onto the plain white envelope. It looked ordinary, almost forgotten, yet the air shifted around it like the calm before a thunderstorm. Richard Collins leaned forward, forcing a chuckle that sounded thinner than before. "Your Honor, unless that is relevant evidence already disclosed, I would suggest we stay on schedule." Maya Williams did not answer immediately. She traced one finger across the handwritten date on the envelope, then looked toward the clerk. "Please confirm for the record when this document entered the court's custody." The clerk swallowed, adjusted her glasses, and checked the electronic log. Fingers tapped nervously against the keyboard. The quiet clicking echoed through the chamber. "Yesterday evening, Your Honor," she replied. "Delivered directly under judicial seal." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard frowned. That was impossible. Every filing connected to this case had crossed his desk weeks ago. Nothing entered without his team knowing. He folded his arms, hiding the sudden dampness gathering across his palms. "I have never seen that document." Maya finally met his eyes. "I know." The two words landed with unsettling calm. Richard felt dozens of people glance toward him at once. He forced another confident smile. "Then perhaps opposing counsel failed to follow procedure." Maya tilted her head slightly. "There is no opposing counsel responsible for this submission." The room became so still that the soft buzz of the ceiling lights seemed louder than the voices that had filled the courtroom only moments earlier. Even the security officer near the rear doors shifted his weight more carefully, his polished shoes squeaking against the stone floor. Maya broke the seal. The paper inside unfolded with a crisp whisper. She did not rush. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, almost surgical. Richard watched her hands. Something deep inside him urged him to stand, to object, to interrupt. Instead, he remained frozen. Maya slid a single photograph across the bench toward the court monitor. Seconds later, the large display flickered to life. Gasps escaped from several rows at once. The image showed an evidence storage room inside the county courthouse. A digital timestamp glowed in the lower corner. Richard stared without blinking. "This image was taken 3 months ago," Maya said quietly. "Court security confirmed its authenticity this morning." Richard cleared his throat. "I failed to see its significance." Maya looked back at the photograph. "Do you?" The camera angle was ordinary. Shelves. Evidence boxes. Fluorescent lights. Nothing unusual. Then someone in the gallery leaned forward. "Wait." Another attorney narrowed his eyes. "Zoom in." Maya nodded toward the technician. The photograph enlarged slowly. Shelf after shelf slid past until the image settled on a single evidence box. Richard's heartbeat hammered inside his ears. There it was. A bright red chain of custody label. Torn. Replaced. The courtroom filled with uneasy whispers. Richard immediately stood. "That proves nothing." His voice came faster than he intended. Maya remained seated. "Sit down, counselor." He hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep talking, to regain control, but something in her steady expression stopped him cold. He lowered himself into the chair. The leather creaked beneath his weight. Maya lifted another page from the envelope. "The photograph is not the evidence." Richard felt the color drain from his face. "It merely tells us where to look." She placed a small silver flash drive beside the photograph. The polished metal reflected the courtroom lights like a blade catching sunlight. Several jurors exchanged nervous glances. The bailiff unconsciously stepped closer to the bench. Maya rested her hand lightly beside the drive. "This device contains the complete surveillance recording from that storage room." Richard's breathing slowed, then stopped altogether. Because he knew with terrifying certainty that every surveillance file from that room had supposedly been erased months earlier. The silver flash drive rested beneath the courtroom lights, its polished surface reflecting across the dark oak bench like a warning no one wanted to acknowledge. No one spoke. Even the faint hum of the ventilation system seemed to disappear. Richard Collins slowly rose again, forcing confidence back into his posture. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. I move that the device be excluded until its authenticity can be verified." His voice was steady, but a thin bead of sweat traced the edge of his collar. Maya Williams looked toward the court technology officer. "Has the chain of custody been verified?" The technician nodded without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor. Verified this morning by the Digital Evidence Unit." Another ripple swept through the gallery. Richard's jaw tightened. That answer had arrived far too quickly. He glanced toward his legal team. 3 associates shuffled through their binders, exchanging confused looks. None of them had expected this. Maya folded her hands calmly. Very well. Please display the recording. The courtroom projector awakened with a low mechanical whir. The large monitor flickered once before security camera footage appeared. Grainy. Silent. A hallway inside the courthouse evidence archive stretched across the screen beneath cold fluorescent lights. Shelves lined both sides like endless gray walls. A digital timestamp glowed in one corner. Richard relaxed almost immediately. Empty hallway. Empty shelves. Nothing. He allowed himself a quiet breath. As I suspected. But Maya never looked at the screen. She watched Richard instead. Do not rush, counselor. The recording continued. 1 minute. 2. 3. Jurors shifted in their seats. Someone in the public gallery quietly cleared a throat. Richard folded his arms again, the familiar confidence returning to his face. This proves absolutely nothing. Maya remained motionless. Keep watching. At exactly 11:38 in the recording, movement appeared at the far end of the hallway. A courthouse employee entered carrying a sealed evidence box. The technician zoomed slightly. The employee placed the box on a shelf before walking away. Richard shrugged. Routine procedure. Maya nodded once. Correct. Another 30 seconds passed. Then another figure entered the frame. A man wearing a maintenance uniform pushed a cleaning cart across the polished floor. His baseball cap covered most of his face. He stopped beside the same evidence shelf. Richard barely looked up. A janitor. Maya said nothing. The man opened the cart, adjusted a mop bucket, then walked away. Richard smiled. Are we seriously wasting the court's time? Several spectators nodded in agreement. It looked completely ordinary. The maintenance worker never touched the evidence box. He never even reached toward it. Richard leaned back, almost amused now. Then Maya quietly spoke 4 words. Freeze the image there. The technician stopped the recording. The maintenance worker stood beside the cart, one hand resting on the handle. Maya looked toward the courtroom. Please zoom into the reflection. Confused murmurs filled the room. Reflection? The technician enlarged the chrome side panel attached to the cleaning cart. The picture blurred. Sharpened. Then sharpened again. A collective gasp swept across the courtroom. Reflected in the polished metal was someone standing behind the maintenance worker. A man in an expensive tailored suit. His face was partially visible, but unmistakable enough to silence the room. Richard's breathing caught. It was not the janitor anyone should have been watching. Maya finally turned toward him. Interesting, is it not? Richard immediately stood. That image is distorted. Reflections cannot be trusted. His words came faster now. Less polished. Less certain. Maya nodded again, almost sympathetically. Ordinarily, I would agree. She reached inside the envelope one final time. Which is precisely why the digital evidence unit recovered the original camera angle from another hallway. Richard's face lost every trace of color. Across the gallery, several reporters quietly reached for their phones beneath the benches. Tiny screens lit up one after another, casting pale blue light across anxious faces. The courtroom no longer looked at Maya as the judge they had laughed at. They looked at her as the only person who already knew how this story ended. Maya placed a second storage device beside the first. Smaller. Black. Unmarked. She looked directly into Richard's eyes, and for the first time that morning, he looked away. This recording, she said softly, shows what happened after the maintenance worker left the hallway. The room fell into absolute silence before the second video began to load. The second storage device clicked into the courtroom computer with a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the silence. Every head turned toward the giant monitor. Even the reporters lowered their phones for a moment, afraid to miss a single frame. Richard Collins stood motionless, but his fingertips dug into the edge of the defense table until his knuckles turned pale. This recording was recovered from an independent hallway camera, Maya Williams said. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle. Unlike the first camera, this one was never altered. Richard shook his head immediately. Objection. There is no foundation. Maya looked directly at him. That objection will be considered after the court sees the evidence. The projector emitted a low mechanical hum before another grainy hallway appeared. This angle faced the evidence archive from across the corridor. Cold fluorescent lights reflected off stainless steel railings. The polished floor shimmered beneath them. The timestamp matched the previous recording down to the second. Again, the maintenance worker crossed the hallway pushing the cleaning cart. Again, nothing appeared unusual. Richard slowly exhaled. A faint smile threatened to return. Exactly as I said? Maya remained perfectly still. Continue. The maintenance worker disappeared through the far exit. 5 seconds passed. 10. The hallway looked empty. Then the elevator doors slid open with quiet precision. A man stepped out wearing a tailored charcoal suit. The courtroom fell silent. Richard stared at the screen without blinking. The man's face remained hidden as he walked confidently toward the evidence room. His movements were deliberate, familiar, almost as if he knew every camera angle inside the building. He stopped outside the secured door. Instead of reaching for an access badge, another hand extended into view from inside the room. Someone had already unlocked the door. Murmurs erupted across the gallery. Maya slowly folded her hands. Pause. The image froze just before the man entered. Zoom in on the wrist. The technician enlarged the frame. The picture sharpened gradually until a polished platinum watch became visible beneath the man's sleeve. Richard's stomach tightened. He recognized it instantly. Limited edition. Custom engraved. Fewer than 20 existed in the country. He owned one. Several attorneys glanced toward Richard almost at the same time. He instinctively covered his left wrist beneath the table. Too late. Maya noticed. So did everyone else. Richard forced out a nervous laugh. Thousands of people own luxury watches. Maya nodded. Correct. His confidence flickered back for one brief second. Then she quietly added, Not with that engraving. The technician enhanced the image further. Tiny letters slowly emerged beneath the watch face. R.C. The gallery exploded into whispered conversations. The bailiff immediately called for order, but even his voice struggled to control the growing tension. Richard stepped forward so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. Anyone could fake initials. His voice cracked before he finished the sentence. Maya did not react. She simply opened another page from the envelope. The court subpoenaed the manufacturer this morning. Richard froze. Maya lifted a certificate bearing the watch company's official seal. This engraving was commissioned 7 years ago. One customer. Richard Collins. Every sound disappeared. Richard felt dozens of eyes settle onto him with unbearable weight. His own associates slowly moved their chairs an inch farther away without realizing they were doing it. Nobody wanted to be standing too close anymore. Richard swallowed hard. This proves I owned a watch. Nothing more. Maya's expression never changed. I agree. Richard blinked, confused. Agree? For the first time since the hearing began, he thought he had found solid ground. Then Maya reached toward the monitor. The watch is not why I asked the court to see this recording. Confusion swept through the room. She pointed instead to the barely visible hand opening the secure evidence door from the inside. The real question, she said softly, is who was waiting for Counselor Collins behind a locked government evidence room after business hours. A hush fell so completely that even the buzzing courtroom lights seemed deafening. The technician slowly enhanced the shadowed figure standing inside the doorway. The outline sharpened. The face began to appear. Richard stared at the screen, and all the color drained from his face as he whispered, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. That cannot be possible. Richard Collins could not pull his eyes away from the frozen screen. The shadow inside the evidence room slowly sharpened as the technician adjusted the image, each click of the keyboard sounding like another crack in the foundation beneath his career. The courtroom waited. No one whispered now. No one moved. Even the reporters forgot to type. Then the face came into focus. A collective gasp swept across the room. It was not a stranger. It was Daniel Harper, the courthouse chief evidence custodian, a man who had testified under oath only 2 weeks earlier that no one had accessed the archive after business hours. Daniel lowered his head on the screen, unlocked the secured door, and stepped aside as Richard Collins walked inside. Richard's chair scraped violently across the hardwood floor. "This is manipulated!" he shouted. "Somebody altered this footage!" His voice echoed against the marble walls before disappearing into stunned silence. Maya Williams remained seated. She neither raised her voice nor struck the gavel. "Mr. Harper is outside this courtroom," she said quietly. "He arrived 30 minutes before today's hearing." Richard's heartbeat pounded so loudly he barely heard the words. His legal team exchanged frightened glances. One associate slowly closed his laptop. Another removed an attorney badge from his jacket and slipped it into his pocket, as though creating distance from Richard could somehow protect him. Richard looked toward the rear doors. They opened with a heavy metallic sound. Daniel Harper entered wearing a dark gray suit instead of his usual courthouse uniform. His shoulders sagged beneath invisible weight. Every pair of eyes followed him as his polished shoes echoed across the stone floor. He refused to look at Richard. Not once. The courtroom felt suddenly warmer. Richard loosened his collar, but the pressure only tightened around his throat. "Daniel," he called, forcing a smile that no longer reached his eyes. "Tell them this recording is fake." Daniel stopped beside the witness stand. His breathing was uneven. One hand trembled against the polished wood railing. Maya studied him carefully. "Mr. Harper," she asked softly, "do you recognize the individual entering the evidence room in this recording?" Daniel closed his eyes for one long second. Richard leaned forward. "Answer carefully." The warning hung in the air like smoke. Daniel opened his eyes again, and something inside him had changed. "Yes," he whispered. The room became impossibly still. "I recognize him." Richard nodded rapidly. "Good. Then tell the court." Daniel finally looked toward Richard. There was no loyalty left in his expression. Only exhaustion. "It is you." A wave of disbelief crashed through the gallery. Several spectators instinctively covered their mouths. Camera shutters erupted in rapid succession. Blue phone screens glowed across the back rows as breaking news alerts were drafted in real time. Richard's face emptied of color. "You are lying." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I have been lying for months." The words landed harder than any objection ever could. Richard slammed both hands onto the defense table. "You signed every report." Daniel nodded. "Because I was told if I did not, people would lose everything." Maya's eyes never left Daniel. "Who told you that?" Daniel swallowed. Tears gathered but never fell. The entire courtroom leaned forward. Richard's breathing became shallow. Every instinct screamed for him to interrupt, but no words came. Daniel looked directly at Maya. "I came today because Judge Williams was the first person who noticed something every investigator ignored." Another murmur spread across the room. Maya had not uncovered the truth by accident. She had seen a detail no one else believed mattered. Richard stared at her in disbelief, realizing the quiet woman everyone had laughed at had been several moves ahead from the very beginning. Daniel reached inside his briefcase with shaking hands. The bailiff instinctively stepped closer before stopping when Daniel slowly produced a thick sealed folder stamped with the words Federal Oversight Division. He placed it gently onto the witness stand. "Everything is in here," he said. "Emails, financial records, security logs, every name." Richard felt the room spinning around him. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. Maya looked at the unopened folder without touching it. "Mr. Harper," she asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "does this file identify every person involved?" Daniel's eyes filled with dread. "No, Your Honor." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. "It identifies the ones we thought were involved." He looked toward the courtroom doors as if expecting someone to appear. "The person behind all of this has never been inside this courtroom, until today." No one looked away from Judge Maya Williams. The courtroom felt unnaturally still, as if even the building itself was holding its breath. The fluorescent lights cast pale reflections across the polished wood, while somewhere above the ceiling, the ventilation system released one slow mechanical hum before falling silent again. Daniel Harper remained frozen beside the witness stand, his fingertips resting lightly on the sealed federal folder. He did not dare open it. He did not need to. Everyone understood its weight. Richard Collins slowly lowered himself into his chair. The leather sighed beneath him. For the first time in 23 years, the man who had always controlled every courtroom could not control his own breathing. His pulse throbbed visibly beneath his jaw. A phone vibrated softly somewhere in the gallery before its owner hurriedly silenced it. Nobody complained. Nobody even turned around. Every eye stayed fixed on Maya. She had not celebrated. She had not smiled. She simply watched the room with the same quiet composure she had carried through every insult, every laugh, every attempt to diminish her. Richard finally spoke, but the arrogance had disappeared from his voice. "Who are you really?" The question slipped out before he realized he had asked it. Maya looked at him for several seconds without answering. Then she reached toward the worn leather folder she had carried into court that morning. The same folder everyone had dismissed as ordinary. Her fingertips rested against its faded cover as though greeting an old friend. "People usually notice what shines," she said softly. "Very few notice what has been quietly waiting in plain sight." Nobody interrupted. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Richard stared at the folder, replaying every moment of the morning in his mind. The laughter. The whispers. The assumptions. He suddenly realized something that sent another wave of cold through his chest. Maya had never reacted emotionally to anything he said because she had known exactly where the hearing was going before it even began. She had not been defending herself. She had been guiding everyone else toward the truth. Daniel swallowed hard. "Your Honor!" His voice barely carried across the room. "There is something I never understood." Maya turned toward him. "Go on." Daniel glanced at Richard before lowering his eyes again. "When your office requested the security archives 6 weeks ago, I thought you were investigating missing evidence." Maya shook her head once. "I was not looking for missing evidence." Several people exchanged confused looks. Richard frowned. "Then what were you looking for?" Maya answered without hesitation. "Patterns." The single word landed heavier than anyone expected. She stood slowly. Her robe settled neatly around her shoulders as she stepped down from the bench. The soft echo of her shoes across the marble floor filled the room with an almost unbearable sense of anticipation. She stopped beside the large courtroom monitor. The dark screen reflected everyone standing behind her. Attorneys, jurors, deputies, reporters, witnesses. One reflection lingered longer than the others. Maya studied it quietly before turning back toward the courtroom. "Evidence tells us what happened," she said. "Patterns tell us who planned it." Richard's hands tightened beneath the table. His breathing became uneven again. He remembered every filing, every delayed motion, every witness who had unexpectedly changed testimony over the last year. At the time they had seemed unrelated. Now they formed something far more dangerous. A design. Across the gallery, one elderly retired judge slowly removed his glasses. He had watched thousands of hearings over 4 decades. He had never seen anyone build a case this way. His expression changed from curiosity to respect without a single word being spoken. Others noticed. One by one, heads that had once turned toward Maya with skepticism now watched her with quiet admiration. The laughter from that morning felt impossible to remember. Richard noticed the shift too. It frightened him more than any document ever could. Reputation could survive accusations. It rarely survived the moment people stopped believing in you. Daniel looked toward the courtroom entrance again. His shoulders stiffened. They are here. The words were barely audible, but every microphone captured them. A heavy silence swept across the room. Then, beyond the closed oak doors, slow footsteps echoed through the courthouse hallway. One measured step. Then another. No one moved. No one spoke. Maya did not even turn around. She simply closed the worn leather folder, rested one hand upon it, and whispered, almost to herself, "Right on time." The brass handle on the courtroom door began to turn. The brass handle turned with a slow metallic click that echoed across the silent courtroom. Every head moved at once. Every phone in the gallery quietly lifted. Even Richard Collins forgot to breathe. The heavy oak door opened, and 3 federal investigators stepped inside, their dark jackets carrying polished silver credentials that caught the cold courthouse lights. Behind them walked an older woman with neatly tied gray hair and a weathered leather briefcase. No one recognized her except Maya Williams. Maya offered the slightest nod. The woman returned it without a smile. Richard looked from one face to another, searching desperately for an ally. He found none. The lead investigator approached the bench and placed a sealed authorization letter before the clerk. "Federal Oversight Division," he said evenly. "We are assuming jurisdiction over all evidence connected to this matter." A wave of whispers swept through the gallery before dying just as quickly. Richard forced himself to stand. "This hearing has become a spectacle." His voice cracked despite every effort to steady it. "You cannot simply walk into my courtroom." The investigator looked at him without emotion. "It is not your courtroom, counselor." The words landed with quiet precision. Richard's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. Maya remained still, allowing the silence to settle before speaking. "Please proceed." The older woman stepped toward the witness stand and unlocked her briefcase with a small brass key. The clicking sound seemed impossibly loud. She removed several aging folders, each marked with dates spanning nearly 8 years. The paper edges had yellowed with time. She placed them beside Daniel Harper's sealed file. "My name is Eleanor Brooks," she said calmly. "Former Chief Auditor for the State Judicial Integrity Commission." Several judges seated in the gallery straightened immediately. One whispered her name under his breath. Richard's eyes widened. Eleanor Brooks had retired 6 years earlier after exposing one of the largest ethics scandals in the state's legal history. He had built much of his early career after her retirement. "I was asked to review Judge Williams' findings," Eleanor continued. "I expected to correct them." She glanced toward Maya. "Instead, I confirmed every single one." The room fell silent again. Richard slowly shook his head. "Impossible." Eleanor opened the oldest folder. "Judge Williams did not discover one corrupted case." She carefully spread dozens of charts across the evidence table. Colored lines connected names, dates, courtrooms, judges, witnesses, and financial transfers. The pattern resembled a web stretching across years of legal decisions. Gasps spread through the spectators. Maya had not been investigating a single hearing. She had uncovered a system. Eleanor pointed toward the center of the chart. "Every altered record." Her finger moved. "Every missing exhibit." Another movement. "Every witness who suddenly changed testimony." Another. "Every financial transfer." Finally, her finger rested upon one name. Richard Collins. Richard stared at the chart as though it belonged to someone else. "No," he whispered. "That cannot be right." Maya finally spoke. "The pattern was never hidden." Her voice carried no anger. Only certainty. "It was simply too large for anyone to recognize until every piece was placed together." Richard looked around the courtroom. The attorneys who had laughed with him that morning avoided his eyes. The reporters no longer chased his reactions. Their cameras followed Maya instead. Even the jurors watched her with quiet respect. The balance of power had shifted so completely that no announcement was necessary. It was visible in every face. Richard lowered himself into his chair, unable to hide the tremor in his hands. For the first time in his career, he realized the room no longer believed him before he even spoke. The humiliation he had tried to force upon Maya had returned with crushing weight. Eleanor carefully removed one final document from the bottom of her briefcase. Unlike the others, it carried a bright red federal seal. She hesitated before handing it to the lead investigator. His expression hardened the moment he read the first page. He slowly lifted his eyes toward Maya. "Judge Williams," he said quietly, "your analysis was incomplete." A ripple of confusion spread through the courtroom. Richard looked up in desperate hope. Maya remained calm. "I know." The investigator took a slow breath. "Because this document identifies someone above everyone on that chart." The room froze once again. He turned the final page toward the bench. Maya read the name in silence. For the first time that day, even her expression changed. The courtroom remained frozen as Judge Maya Williams lowered the final page onto the bench with extraordinary care. No one asked whose name she had just read. Somehow, everyone understood that speaking too soon would shatter the fragile silence settling over the room. The fluorescent lights reflected softly across the polished wood, while the ventilation system released a slow, steady breath that seemed louder than any voice. Richard Collins searched Maya's face, desperate for triumph, anger, anything he could fight against. He found neither. Only quiet resolve. The lead federal investigator closed the red file without another word. "The identity will remain sealed until the federal inquiry begins," he announced. "No further discussion will occur in open court." A ripple of disappointment crossed the gallery, but it quickly dissolved into something else. Respect. Nobody questioned the decision. They simply watched Maya. Daniel Harper slowly removed his witness badge and placed it on the railing with trembling fingers. "I spent months believing nobody would ever notice," he whispered. "You noticed everything." Maya shook her head gently. "No. I noticed the people everyone else stopped seeing." Daniel lowered his eyes. The words struck him harder than any accusation. Across the courtroom, an elderly woman seated in the public gallery quietly wiped away a tear. She had laughed that morning when Richard made his first joke. Now she could barely look toward the bench. The young law students filling the back rows exchanged silent glances, their notebooks forgotten. They had arrived expecting to watch another celebrated attorney dominate a courtroom. Instead, they had witnessed something entirely different. Richard remained standing, though his confidence had long since collapsed. His expensive suit suddenly looked too heavy on his shoulders. His carefully rehearsed arguments no longer mattered. He looked toward Maya, his voice barely recognizable. "I judged you before you ever spoke." Maya met his eyes without bitterness. "Most people did." The simplicity of her answer left him speechless. There was no satisfaction in her expression. No revenge. Only the quiet honesty of someone who had carried that burden for a very long time. Richard lowered his head. The room noticed. Cameras continued recording, but nobody rushed forward. The silence itself had become the story. One of Richard's senior associates slowly walked around the counsel table and stood beside Maya instead. He extended a hand, hesitating for only a second. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Maya accepted the handshake with calm dignity. "Then let it become a better choice tomorrow." The young attorney nodded, unable to hide the emotion gathering in his eyes. One by one, others followed. Attorneys who had laughed. Court staff who had whispered. Even the bailiff who had watched the humiliation unfold that morning stepped forward with a respectful nod. No speeches. No excuses. Just silent acknowledgement. The atmosphere inside the courtroom transformed almost imperceptibly. The same people who had measured Maya by her skin color now measured themselves by their own actions. Richard watched every handshake. Every quiet gesture of respect. Every person crossing an invisible line that no legal ruling could ever force them to cross. He realized reputation was not what he had truly lost that day. He had lost the trust that authority alone could never buy back. Maya gathered her worn leather folder, the faded edges softened by years of careful use. It still looked ordinary, just as it had when she first entered the courtroom through laughter and whispers. She slipped the final document inside and closed it gently. The sound was almost inaudible, yet everyone seemed to hear it. The lead investigator approached her before leaving. "Judge Williams," he said softly, "history will remember this hearing." Maya looked past him toward the courthouse windows where late afternoon sunlight had begun replacing the cold fluorescent glow. "I hope history remembers why it happened," she replied. "Not because someone was exposed. Because too many people were ignored." No one answered. There was nothing left to add. The investigators quietly departed. Reporters lowered their cameras. The gallery remained seated, unwilling to break the moment. Richard stood alone beside the empty counsel table, watching Maya walk toward the courtroom doors with the same measured steps she had taken that morning. This time, however, nobody laughed. As her hand reached the brass handle, she paused for the briefest moment. Without turning around, she looked toward the state seal carved high above the bench. Her eyes rested there with quiet gratitude, as though remembering someone who had believed in her long before anyone else did. Then she whispered a single name so softly that only the nearest microphone caught it, and the entire courtroom realized there was still one final truth they had not yet heard. The name Maya had whispered lingered in the silent courtroom long after the sound had faded. No one asked who it belonged to. Somehow, everyone understood it was not meant for them. She rested one hand against the worn leather folder before opening the heavy oak door. Warm evening light spilled through the hallway, washing away the cold blue glow that had filled the courtroom all day. Her footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. Calm. Unhurried. Behind her, no one moved. The cameras that had chased every dramatic moment slowly lowered. Reporters closed their notebooks without speaking. For the first time all afternoon, the room had stopped searching for another headline. Richard Collins remained standing beside the empty counsel table, staring at the place where Maya had stood only seconds before. His reflection stared back from the polished surface of the wood, looking older than it had that morning. He loosened his tie, not because it was uncomfortable, but because the weight he felt no longer came from fabric. It came from memory. He remembered every joke, every dismissive smile, every quiet assumption that had earned laughter from the gallery. None of them sounded clever anymore. They echoed now like evidence. Daniel Harper quietly approached him. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Richard exhaled. "I kept believing I was the smartest person in every room," Daniel answered without judgment. "That was never the problem." Richard looked toward the courtroom doors where Maya had disappeared. "Then what was?" Daniel's voice remained almost a whisper. "You stopped looking at people. You only looked at positions." Richard lowered his eyes. There was nothing left to argue. Across the courtroom, the elderly woman who had laughed that morning slowly walked toward the empty bench. She placed her hand against the polished rail for only a moment before quietly leaving. One by one, the others followed. No applause. No celebration. Only respectful silence. The courthouse gradually emptied until the only sounds remaining were distant footsteps fading down long hallways, and a soft hum of lights preparing for the evening. Outside, Maya stepped onto the broad courthouse steps. The city had begun to glow beneath the golden colors of sunset. A cool breeze lifted the edge of her robe before settling again. She paused beside the bronze statue of Lady Justice standing at the entrance. Years earlier, as a young law student, she had stopped there almost every morning before class. Back then, people often walked past without noticing her. Today, people slowed. A young black girl holding her father's hand stopped halfway up the steps. She looked at Maya with wide, uncertain eyes. Maya smiled gently. Nothing more. The little girl smiled back. Her father removed his cap respectfully as they continued inside the courthouse. Maya watched them disappear through the same doors she had just exited. Hope, she thought, rarely arrived with noise. It usually entered quietly. Behind her, the courthouse flag shifted gently in the evening wind. Richard stepped outside moments later. He saw Maya standing alone beneath the fading light. For a long moment he simply watched, unsure whether he deserved another word. Finally he walked forward. His expensive shoes sounded strangely small against the wide stone steps. When he stopped beside her, he did not reach for a handshake. He did not offer excuses. He simply said, "I never saw you." Maya kept her eyes on the horizon where the last sunlight reflected against the courthouse windows like polished gold. "I know." Another silence settled between them. This one felt different. Lighter. Richard nodded once. "I will." Maya looked at him for the first time. "Then make sure the next person never has to earn the respect you should have given freely." Richard swallowed hard. "I will try." Maya offered one final nod before walking down the courthouse steps. Her robe moved gently with each measured stride until she disappeared into the crowd, no longer the center of attention, just another person moving through the city she had quietly changed. The last rays of sunlight caught the brass nameplate beside the courtroom entrance. The engraved letters reflected across the stone before the light slowly faded. Judge Maya Williams. No one laughed. The silence that remained sounded exactly like justice.